Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. This is the first of a cycle of webinars and other initiatives that we're developing at the Universidad de O'Higgins. As some of you know or might not know, this is a state-funded university in Chile, in Rancagua, small town close to Santiago, but that already belongs to a different region. The organization of these seminars belongs to the Institute of Social Sciences, where I'm an academic, and on behalf of the director of our institute, but also of the rectory and the university, I want to give you a warm welcome. Today, I'm very honored and humbled to have three guests with us. I'm going to start by giving you a very small introduction of our invitees. And the topic of the webinar today is to talk about the current situation in Palestine, both in Gaza with the military incursion that occurred after October the 7th, but also recognizing that this has been an occupation that has been going on for decades. So considering that this is an historical process that has led to this situation, and also not forgetting what is also happening in the West Bank, right? So a brief introduction. Dana Al-Kurd is a political scientist and an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, of the University of Richmond. She specializes in comparative politics and international relations of the Arab world, particularly focusing in how authoritarianism endures and how societies meaningfully challenge, as well as the state-society relationships in these countries and the impact of international intervention in these contexts. In 2020, she published a book titled Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine with Oxford University Press. So Dana, thank you very much for being here. Then Marcelo Marzuca, who is based in Chile, is a lawyer and sociologist and currently a professor of Arab Studies at the Catholic University of Chile and a research associate at the Eugenio Chawan Center for Arab Studies at the University of Chile. His work focuses on the economic and political aspects of the Arab world, with an emphasis on Palestine, Lebanon, and the Arabian Gulf. Previously, he was a member of the United Nations Board of Editors, where he worked with the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, and various UN agency peacekeeping missions and the criminal tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Finally, we have with us Joanna Ray Folhart, who is a social psychologist and associate professor of psychology at Clark University, where she directs the social psychology PhD program. At Clark, she is also affiliated with the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Peace Studies program, and the Center for Gender and Race Studies. Her research focuses on the psychological impact of collective victimhood, focusing on questions such as how do people make sense of oppression and violence against their group? How do different beliefs about collective victimhood relate to intergroup attitudes and social and political views? What explains different resistance strategies in violent and repressive contexts? And how is group-based power understood in the context of oppression? So first of all, I'm sorry, I have some. So first of all, I would like to give the word to Dana, and I would like to hear from your own research with the Palestinian diaspora, and also about the main findings and the rationale of your book that you published, well, quite recently, and how this connects also with what is currently happening specifically in Gaza, but also with the atrocities that are currently happening there, but also in the West Bank, and how we recently saw that is significantly increasing in the West Bank in recent days. So you have the word is yours, the floor is yours, and feel free to share some slides if you want to.
Yeah, can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So it's a, obviously a very big topic. To stay within the limits of the 10 minutes, what I'm going to focus on is as the slides suggest, Palestinian politics and the ongoing legitimacy crisis of Palestinian political actors, because this has become, I mean, it's been an ongoing problem, and especially as the discussion now turns to what do we do with Gaza, what is the day after going to look like, and every international actor has particular motivations. I think it's important to note how we got to this kind of position where the current Palestinian political actors lack the legitimacy, and continued policies of a certain type will only exacerbate the problem. But of course, I'm happy, since I don't want to go over my time, I'm happy during the Q&A to talk about current conditions in the West Bank, what's happening in Jenin, how they relate to what's happening in Gaza, and diaspora, anything else. Okay, so as you said, my previous work, including my book, has looked at the development of the Palestinian Authority, in particular after the Oslo Accords, so after the peace agreement between the PLO and the State of Israel. And I looked at specifically how the international intervention, with a focus on American intervention as the key actor, how it led to particular dynamics within the Palestinian Authority that have damaged the Palestinian cause in a lot of ways. The main actors the reason I'm listing them is because people can get lost in a sea of acronyms. So just to be really clear about who I'm talking about. So the Palestine Liberation Organization is the internationally recognized representative of the Palestinian people, is a national liberation movement, is an umbrella organization, so it includes a number of different political parties within it, and does not include Hamas or Islamic Jihad. The Palestinian Authority is the apparatus that emerged after the Oslo Accords. It was supposed to be kind of subordinate to the PLO, but in a lot of ways it has bypassed the PLO. The PLO now is generally a zombie organization that doesn't function, and the Palestinian Authority has become the main actor when international negotiations or anything like that are discussed. Fatah is the main party that continues to dominate the Palestinian Authority. And then, of course, people, I'm sure, especially in the last couple of months, have discussed Hamas at length. And so Hamas is another political movement that includes a military wing and is outside the fold of the PLO. And then Israel and the United States and how they impact all of these actors we'll discuss as we go. So kind of the takeaway, I think, for all of my slides are on this one. The impact of the Oslo Accords was that this national liberation movement, the PLO, was turned into a state-building process despite ongoing occupation. And it reduced the question of Palestine and reduced the question of Palestinian self-determination to just the occupied Palestinian territories, so just West Bank and Gaza, which meant that the Palestinian diaspora, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are also part of the body politic of the Palestinian people, and Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Palestinian refugees, of course, everybody in the diaspora, whether a refugee status or not, really don't have a space in this discussion. That has been a very harmful reduction of the Palestinian question in some ways, that is perpetuated by the continuation of the Palestinian Authority and the continued insistence on the part of international actors to only engage with the Palestinian Authority on these limited questions. Because of that, and for a variety of reasons, which I'll discuss, this has also led to a divergence between Palestinian political elites and Palestinian publics. So what the publics want is not represented, and political elites are not at all held accountable to the kinds of policies that they support or engage in, including, for example, security coordination with the State of Israel. And for quite a bit of time, perhaps now there's a bit of a difference, but that led to a kind of political polarization within Palestinian politics between Hamas and Fatah, and an unaddressed legitimacy crisis. So the international community continued to uphold the Palestinian Authority, continued to uphold Fatah's domination of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas for its own purposes and for its own preferences, also benefited to some degree from this equilibrium. And nobody, for at least the past decade, nobody has really been able to move beyond this kind of binary. So yeah, this is what I just said. The PA during Arafat's time, the first president of the Palestinian Authority, it was on the left, attempted to play a kind of balancing act between what the public wanted and what the Americans wanted, what Israel wanted. But there was a great deal of Western and American intervention during this time that hollowed out grassroots Palestinian organizations, which were the main mechanism by which Palestinians organized and held their leadership accountable. And so in that kind of vein, Palestinian civil society and the Palestinian public didn't really have a space to engage in politics in the same way as they once did. Then the Palestinian Second Intifada erupts, the second uprising. Arafat during this time is sidelined, eventually dies, and Mahmoud Abbas is elevated as the leader of the Palestinian Authority, leader of Fatah, as the guy that Americans speak to. And in his background, he's very much, as a member of the PLO, was very much like the diplomat and engaged with international actors in this way. So since the Second Intifada, Abbas has remained the status quo and the kind of holdover, even though he really doesn't have an impact on the Arab world, has very little legitimacy, as I'm going to show, with the Palestinian public. And the US, despite upholding him and being a key reason why he was able to weather the past 20 years, don't really engage with him in good faith either. So everybody, the main kind of international actors, Israel, the United States, have essentially accepted, and up to October 7th, they had essentially accepted this kind of status quo. And there was really no American policy and no American appetite for reforming this situation of a Palestinian Authority with limited scope of control, of this divergence between elites and their publics, of the Hamas Fatah polarization. And they did not support the creation of any kind of unity government. And during this time also, they emboldened the Palestinian Authority, given that there was no accountability anymore to the Palestinian public. They emboldened the Palestinian Authority and encouraged the Palestinian Authority to engage in repression and to engage in increased attempts to control the Palestinian public. And so there was, during this time, a great deal of Palestinian Authority Israeli coordination for political repression. Even within Fatah Party, the dominant party of the Palestinian Authority that Mahmoud Abbas heads, they've really sidelined alternatives to his position and to his rule. In 2021, there was a discussion of elections, and despite the limitations of what elections can do, there was a great deal of let's say enthusiasm, particularly by young people who hadn't ever voted. So I have here on the left the logo of a particular group called Jil al-Tajdid al-Demokrati, that where it's at least saying, this could be a way for us to start to impact politics, to bring younger people into Palestinian politics. Nasser al-Qadwa, who was from Fatah Party, who's on the top right, emerged as an alternative, as a possible person to come after Mahmoud Abbas and a couple of other people. But elections were eventually canceled, and this, Americans had really no appetite, no level of support for actually reforming Palestinian politics internally so that it can become accountable to Palestinian public opinion. So what we saw up to October 7th, and we see this from polling from the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, is that there's a great deal of frustration amongst Palestinians and a lack of trust, both in Mahmoud Abbas as the president and in the Palestinian Authority as an entity, and increased frustration of the American role, and also an increasingly zero-sum view of the conflict with Israel. So it's not confusing why they would have this view, because they're increasingly under attack and nobody's defending them and they have no way of impacting their own politics. So it's like, okay, well, this seems existential. That makes perfect sense. So, for example, in September 2023, in a poll right before October 7th, 78% of Palestinians wanted Abbas to resign. 76% were dissatisfied with his governance. And 58% supported a return to confrontations and armed uprising. And so in the aftermath of October 7th, we see these trends kind of increase in terms of the lack of legitimacy for Abbas in particular, and I'll show in a second the Palestinian Authority. So what this shows is the West Bank. I don't know if you can see my cursor. West Bank, Gaza Strip, and then total. And from September 2023, right before October 7th, to the last poll that was conducted in June. And so you see an increase, for example, in the West Bank of from 78 to 94% of people who want Abbas to resign. Similar increases when you aggregate across both territories. And then when you see also in terms of political parties, what September, right before October 7th, what the September poll showed is that both political parties really had very little support, had their core constituencies and had very little wide public support. But since October 7th, we see increases in support for Hamas, in particular in the West Bank. So from 12% support for Hamas to 41% support of Hamas. Interestingly, in Gaza, that number has not changed very much, probably because people in Gaza are paying the brunt of the cost for what's going on. But then again, in aggregate, the Palestinian public in the West Bank and Gaza has increased the support of Hamas from 22% to 40% as a result of these dynamics of the really complete lack of political vision that other political actors in the Palestinian political sphere have presented. So there have been some discussions, especially because everybody's talking about the day after and what should we do with Hamas, who should govern Gaza. Obviously, Israelis reject all of these discussions. Israel is saying their military rule is going to be the only rule in the Gaza Strip, if there is indeed there is going to be a Gaza Strip left. But from within Palestinian politics, there have been people, whether it's the most recent Prime Minister Shteye or others who have been affiliated with the PA in the past, like Salam Fayyad, who have floated these ideas about reviving the PLO and possibly incorporating Hamas within the PLO. And Palestinian public is pretty adamant. And so I have a screenshot here of a letter that was circulated back in, I think, November or December, of Palestinian activists, both in Gaza and outside Gaza, who basically are adamant that these discussions should not be taking place until there is a ceasefire, until the genocide ends. But generally speaking, there's been a persistent lack of policy, both within the Palestinian political space as well as internationally, that has a huge impact on what the PA can do for resolving this crisis, for resolving the fact that Palestinian politics does not reflect Palestinian society. Americans are still discussing this concept of revitalizing the PA as if that would solve, if we get new people in the PA, that this would solve this problem and that we could be able to govern the West Bank and Gaza and go back to some sort of status quo. But this is absolutely unsustainable. There continues to be no societal input, which is why it's unsustainable. And all of this is reflected in the backlash, not only against what I showed you, against Mahmoud Abbas, against the political parties that are involved in Palestine, but also against the American role. So Palestinians are super angry. And the region is also super angry about these conditions. The latest polling from the Arab Opinion Index in January had something like 96 or 97% disapproval of the United States, which is maybe the highest we've seen. And all of this, what this creates is a precedent for increased mass violence and mass displacement. If there isn't a political horizon, Israel can continue to say well, we have to be operating here. We have to, there's no alternatives, which is of course by design. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dana. That's a very interesting overview regarding both the national and international politics, and also this idea of the failed or the difficult or almost impossible solutions, right? Because also the fact that Israel is not interested, and also the American intervention being barring the potential solutions, um, no matter what they could be, right? Because in the moment, as you very well said, under the current situation and the current genocide happening, there can be no political discussions. I would like now to move to Marcelo's presentation, and I think they can go along quite well, because then we have the political aspects, but we also have the legal aspects. So that has been going on throughout time, and this didn't start in October 7th. And I think that's very important to reiterate. And you have your own experience, both as a lawyer, but also as a sociologist. And I also know you want to share some ideas and some historical facts that have been leading to this very terrible situation and human rights violation. So go ahead, Marcelo, please.
Thank you, and I'll try to be up to the expectations. Um, I like to share my screen as well. Please don't be alarmed. I'm not pretending to go over all the slides, hopefully, but not necessarily. But I would like to focus on the legal framework throughout certain episodes in history, and what I think that is a battle for the narrative as well. So first, colonization versus indigenous. The Zionist enterprise began as a colonizing quest. It is observable in Herzl's diaries, in his main publication, The Jewish State, in the Zionist war congresses. But now what we see is a change in how things are presented. And as at the beginning of the 20th century, it was fashionable to be colonizing other countries. There we see some comic drawings from the Italian occupation in the Maghreb, and the British conquest of Egypt. Now the shift is, or what is acceptable is to frame one's existence as indigenous, right? So the Zionist narrative has changed in that aspect. However, when we see the legal documentation, that does not make it valid, but it's at least legal in shape. um, it all refers to an colonizing enterprise, right? Which disregards actually the desires of the Palestinian native population in their different declarations and congresses. This is also observable in the defense of the right of return for the Palestinian refugees. That although it's declared in different UN resolutions and by the law of succession of states, Israel has constantly denied its responsibility in the refugees, although the Plan Dalit and historical documents on how displacement occurred during 46 to 50 says another thing. And it shelters this narrative with the concept of defense, right? So everything that goes against the defense of this state seems to be an impossible. One debate that I like, conceptually like, is the debate between occupied territories and disputed territories. As we may all know, the Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, from 48 and to 67 were occupied by Egypt and by Jordan. And after the 67 or the June war, they went to be occupied by Israel. This has been understood by the occupying force as a shelter to legitimize colonization. However, the occupation in international law does not refer to a framework for colonization. It is actually a measure of, and it's an obligation for the occupying power to protect the occupied people in the context of war or belligerent forces engaging. So the occupying force, the occupying power, has obligations to the occupied people, such as protect their lives, their private property, their family honor, their religious convictions, their practices, their properties. However, and also there's a prohibition to transfer population from the occupying power to the occupied territory. Especially the last paragraph of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention says the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Clear. This is even recognized by the Israeli military regulation from the year 1967. However, what Israel has been doing for the past 50 and more years is to continue to build Jewish-only settlements, colonies in the West Bank and in Gaza, that the ones in Gaza were dismantled in 2005. But in the West Bank, there has been a continuous settlement expansion that has made it impossible for the territorial continuity of this piece of territory. In general, different UN resolutions are broadly quoted. The right of return of resolution 184, the duty to retreat from the occupied territories in resolution 242 and 338 several decades ago, and we're still waiting. So then when Oslo came, and there was kind of an initial optimism that Dana mentioned, what was intended with the Oslo Agreement, and this is very easy to see when one reads Shimon Peres's autobiography, was not to start building a Palestinian state in the occupied Palestinian territories. Rather, it was to establish this provisional and limited authority of the Palestinian Authority in the densely populated areas, meaning the urban centers, the cities, which are marked there in red. Also Gaza. This gave Israel the framework, the perfect framework to concentrate Palestinian Authority in the urban areas where mostly where the population lives, while keeping, and within a certain agreement, keeping their authority in most of the occupied territories where the natural resources, water, and the agricultural lands are. So this is the perfect combination for the colonial quest. You have a population limited within the territory they can go, that are a source of cheap labor, although very educated. They are also a place where you can sell your manufactured products, and at the same time, you obtain the domain of the natural resources, which is the perfect framework for the colonizing quest. This has meant not only the appropriation of the natural resources of the occupied territories, but also the constant colonization of the land. That is Jebel Bognem, a hill near Bethlehem, which is now the Hadhoma colony. And that is 97, then 2001, and then 2010. That is how the situation on the ground has changed. One can see it also with the apartheid wall that is built. 85% of it's built in Palestinian territory. Although there is a consultative opinion of the International Court of Justice on this from 2004 that requests the stop of its construction and dismantling. They have kept building it. This is from Aida, a refugee camp in Bethlehem, overlooking the Bethlehem farmland that is just in the middle of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So the wall also serves as a way to appropriate with more land. Now going to the ICJ advisory opinion that was just released a month ago. Some relevant aspects. Israel exploits the natural resources of the occupied territory, including water, minerals, and other natural resources, for the benefit of its own population, to the disadvantage or even exclusion of the local Palestinian population. Clear. That includes the Dead Sea skincare products that, at least in Chile, are very popular. For example, Israel has granted mining concessions to Israeli-operated quarries in Area C. By contrast, it has been reported that Israel has not issued quarrying permits for Palestinian companies in Area C since 1990. Now, forced transfer, which is forbidden under the Geneva Conventions. Israel policies and practices are contrary to the prohibition of forcible transfer of the protected population under Fourth Geneva Convention. Regarding the annexation, the policies and practices amount to annexation of large parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, which is contrary to the prohibition of the use of force in international relations and its corollary principle of non-acquisition of territory by force. In conclusion, the advisory opinion mentions that Israel has been aiming to extend its sovereignty to certain parts of the occupied territory, to gradually annexate them to Israeli territory, with the intention to create a permanent and irreversible Israeli presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. As such, and as a conclusion, the sustained abuse by Israel of its own position as an occupying power that has obligations to the occupied people through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the Palestinian territory violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as unlawful. Then, the court says that Israel has an obligation to put an end to those unlawful acts, must immediately cease all new settlement activity, has also the obligation to repeal all legislation and measures creating this unlawful situation, and all measures aim at modifying the demographic composition of any parts of the territory. In addition, to provide obligation to have an obligation to provide full reparation for the damage caused. And this is the last point. As such, all states are under an obligation not to recognize the legal situation arising from the unlawful presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining this unlawful situation in the occupied territory, and also, while respecting the Charter of the United Nations and international law, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in that convention. So, the states have an obligation to ensure compliance by Israel of international humanitarian law. I am a very pessimist person on this. I think that this is a very nice advisory opinion that is very well written, but we've seen the obligation of Israel to retreat from the occupied territory since 1967, which was repeated in 1973. During several negotiations, during the Oslo Accords, during the 2000 and 2008 negotiations, every time it was deemed as necessary for Israel to stop its colonization of the occupied territory, and every time it wasn't respected. So yeah, that's the problem with international law. I think I'll stop here, and happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. That's quite an overview of both the historical condemnation of the status quo within the occupied territories and the obligations of Israel within international law, and also the United Nations resolution, which brings us, I think, to a different topic, right? The resistance of the Palestinian people. Also, this disconnect that Tana was also mentioning between the political elites and the population and the public, the Palestinian public, and how to deal with this discontent that is currently happening on the ground, and that, of course, has significantly increased with the incursion of the military into Gaza, with the current genocide that is happening, the humanitarian law that is not being applied, and also the human rights violations that are occurring. I would like to hear from you, Joanna. What are the dynamics of victimhood in a way that are enabling, for example, the Israeli authorities to continue to justify what is going on the ground? And also the ways in which Palestinian people, also both on the ground, but in terms of the diaspora and its allies, can resist what is going on, and in terms of allyship, but also of Palestinians itself, the Palestinian community, both within the occupied territories, where we know there is significant restrictions in movement, in freedom of speech even, and of course, where in Gaza people have to survive, and these are basic needs that don't even allow you to think about other more complex needs that people would have.
And all in 10 minutes. Those are very big topics.
Yes, I know. You can focus on the ones you
Yeah.
prefer, of course.
Yeah, and I actually did not prepare a presentation. I was not aware my co-panelists would have proper slides, so I'm going to be more conversational and probably focus more on the question of how it is legitimized from the perspective of victim narratives, because that connects nicely to the title of Marcelo's. I mean, it has been my main research topic for one, and also I'm Jewish myself, so probably better prepared to talk about that than about Palestinian resistance, although I researched that a little bit. I might not be the best person to talk about it, but it also connects nicely to Marcelo's title, which was Battle for Narratives. And, you know, that's a good connection perhaps between the political and legal level and then the psychological level. As you said, Anna, each power struggle, each act of collective violence, each assault on human rights needs some sort of narrative and you know, psychological infrastructure to justify it so that people can oh wait, I have to confirm my speaking language. It tells me here. Sorry, did you all get that as well? All right. Okay, so yes, each you know, each political act of violence and everything we're seeing in terms of how the power structures are maintained does require a psychological narrative to legitimize it. So that's where we can come in as political psychologists and social psychologists, without being, you know, blind and naive to the real role of power, as Marcelo and Dana both presented, and without wanting to just reduce everything to psychological dynamics, right? Because that is to some extent what we see when it comes to the role of historical victimization and collective cultural trauma with regard to justifying the violence that is being perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians, and how it is also being supported in the US, in Germany, and many other places. There's often a recurse to Jewish historical victimhood and kind of the sense of entitlement to do whatever it takes to defend oneself because of the Holocaust, because of what happened to Jews in the past, as well as a focus on present-day threats that are perceived or imagined with regard to terrorism, right? So we see this recourse to psychological narratives around collective victim beliefs, as well as present-day safety discourse in order to justify, legitimize, and uphold basically the global world order and the political, you know, the power relations, and to kind of give it a human touch and make it seem, you know, nicer what is happening. So social psychologists have been studying how people make sense of collective victimization, and this is what I've been working on primarily. And what is interesting to see there is that, you know, we currently see a lot of this discourse really playing out in, you know, how Israel defends itself or presents its right to do what it's doing, but also how allies of Israel and people supporting the repression of Palestine solidarity movements in the US are justifying it. But what we also see is that there's a homogenization of these collective victim beliefs, and people tend to ignore the fact that actually it isn't just one homogeneous hegemonic narrative, but people have different ways of making sense of both historical victimization and present-day threat or safety issues. Not all Jews see this in the same way, and we can see, you know, a real divide between how, for example, anti-Zionist Jews working with Jewish Voice for Peace, or, you know, other leftist Jews who are active in Palestine solidarity movements, how they are defining and understanding Jewish victimhood, and then how the majority mainstream, you know, Zionist Jews, but also Zionist Christians and others supporting Israel are construing it, right? And there's really a divide and disconnect in how it's seen. So based on the research on the social psychology of collective victimhood, we know that people can either, for example, construe their groups or other groups' victimization in exclusive ways that focuses on the uniqueness and the perceived greater severity of the group's suffering compared to other groups, right? We have suffered more, we have suffered in unique ways, etc. But then conversely, others within the same group see parallels and similarities between their group's victimization and what others are experiencing. And this is exactly what, one of the dimensions we see that differs and that, differentiates, for example, anti-Zionist Jews or any Jews standing in solidarity with Palestine, who say, look, what happened to us in the Holocaust is similar to what is happening to Palestinians and Gazans today. And because of what happened to us, we are responsible to ensure that it doesn't happen to others. Which is this more inclusive lesson and construal compared to the exclusive lesson and construal because of what happened to us that is unique and more severe than what happened to anyone else. We are entitled to, defend ourselves from anything, whatever it takes, right? But that's just one dimension. We also see a differentiation or a difference in terms of whether Jews and other people supporting them perceive their group's victimization as something perpetual and ongoing, something that has been going on for, 2,000 or 3,000 years, that happened in the past, culminated in the Holocaust, but also continues in the present with other perpetrators and enemies, but basically, taking the same general shape and form, just perpetrated through other groups. And kind of projecting a perceived threat into the future as well, right? So linking past, present, and future with regard to historical victimization. And then other Jews and their supporters who see a sense of closure, historical closure, right? And perceive that compared to what happened to, like, yes, we were a persecuted minority, but in the present we are fine. And in fact, we have power and are, perpetrating violence ourselves. So a sense of perpetual victimhood versus historical victimization with historical closure is another psychological dimension that varies. And then I already mentioned this, but kind of related to it, the degree to which people perceive present-day power and privilege as opposed to just disadvantage and suffering and continued vulnerability and threat. And also linked to that, the degree to which Jews are willing to acknowledge that they are also a perpetrator group in the context of Israel and not just this historical victim group, right? So there are at least 4 or 5 different psychological dimensions with regard to how people construe collective victimization that we find not just among Jews, but also among other victim groups. And of course, there are a few other dimensions as well that I haven't mentioned that are relevant. But it does help explain, some of the psychology behind why some Jewish Americans, Jewish Israelis, etc., perceive this sense of ongoing threat that they then use and that others also use and instrumentalize. And that's really important, I think, to emphasize as well, that all of these narratives are instrumentalized. Sometimes it's a sincere sense of threat and so on and concern for others. But we also see that, both in the US with the Christian Zionists, as well as in Germany with sometimes right-wing supporters of Israel, like AfD, many of them will use and utilize and instrumentalize these narratives while also actually being anti-Semitic themselves, right? And they wouldn't be drawing on these narratives of collective victimhood and caring so much allegedly about anti-Semitism, something that affects a small minority group in the world, if it wouldn't serve the purpose of upholding global world order, right? And wouldn't serve the interests of the political class. So I think that's really important to always keep in mind, that it's not just purely psychology. It interacts with the power structures, and it's oftentimes conveniently used to justify what's happening. And I'll stop there, but we can get into other questions maybe during the discussion.
Yes, I think we can now move more into a conversation. So far, I know there are no questions here and also not on YouTube. Just so you know, there are more people joining us and listening to us from the YouTube channel. Just as a reminder, if anyone who's listening here can use the Q&A to write any comments or questions you have for our panelists, and also who's connected on YouTube can also use the live chat to get us all of your questions and comments as well. We're connected, so we can also share those questions and comments here. Taking exactly and grabbing all of these psychological, social, political, and also legal perspectives that are coming together. And this idea of maintaining the status quo, or actually challenging the status quo in terms of the situation in Palestine and the current occupation of the Palestine territories that has been happening for decades and that has been acknowledged by different institutions and organizations at the international level. And even though there have been legal resolutions and in terms of the right to return, but also in terms now recently of defining the occupation as illegal and demanding a full stop to the construction of new settlements and also the reparations involved with the construction of former settlements. The reality on the field is making it very, very hard to actually think about a concrete solution, right? And this also brings us, and as Dana said, you have the people living in the occupied territories, but we are also aware of the situation of the refugees outside these territories who are spread in many parts of the world. For example, Chile is one of the countries outside the Middle East. Well, it actually has the biggest diaspora outside of the Middle East, the Palestinian diaspora. And I should also say that Dana and Marcelo, if I may, you're also part of this diaspora, and Joanna, as she herself mentioned, she's part of the anti-Zionist Jewish community, which I think it's also important in terms of positionality. I would like to know how you think about the solidarity movements that are happening across the world that are, of course, being led sometimes by the Palestinian diaspora themselves, by allies that belong to these Jewish anti-Zionist communities, but also other people who not necessarily have specific identities that are directly connect them with the conflict, but just connect them with the cause in terms of the situation that is going on in terms of moral or ethical grounds or any other reasons that we know from research and also just from talking with people on asking them why they join, and how you envision. Maybe the question will be having different answers coming from the different perspectives and research that you do. How you envision the potential effects that this have, because we've seen like the movements are growing in size. The petitions in terms of requests to governments is an end to the occupation, for example, is the call for a permanent ceasefire, is the call for the withdrawal of the Israeli military forces. But then there's also the day after, of course. But this hasn't really shifted the needle in terms of international relations, and mostly in terms of the positions of the governments that are still allowing this to happen, even if there are legal positions saying, what's happening is unlawful, and organizations saying this violates international humanitarian law, with organizations and scholars, they're saying this falls within a genocide with the proper definition of what is occurring. So how do you see this mismatch, right, between what's happening at the institutional and governmental level in many different countries, like Joanna mentioned, and some of you mentioned, like, for example, the United States and Germany and many countries within Europe, but then the population in these countries that are also creating these movements. What do you think about this mismatch, but also the solidarity movements that are occurring in these different parts of the world?
Is there anybody anybody wants to go first?
Maybe Dana, since you
Oh,
were
maybe me, because I opened the microphone.
definitely.
Okay. So yeah, so a lot of my research in the after my book has been about Palestinian activism and the role of Palestine in particular the anti-authoritarian resistance. So maybe I can cover some of my findings from that, and then discuss the current moment. As you mentioned, I'm part of the diaspora as well. I'm in the US. So I moved from Jerusalem to the United States. So I've researched the impact of Palestine on civil society and on anti-authoritarian resistance within the Arab world. Palestine is a really key factor in politicizing Arab citizens, so non-Palestinians in other parts of the Arab world, to become critical of their own regimes and critical of the role that the regimes play, not just in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but and in their lack of support for Palestinians, but also in terms of their lack of accountability to their own citizens. So I've looked at Palestine as kind of like a gateway to dissent in the Arab world. And we see that anytime that there is a political opening of any kind, Palestine is, you know, a key issue. And people use Palestine as a key issue to then expand their scope of criticism. And the people who engaged in the Arab Spring uprising in Egypt, for example, they began their political kind of awakening and politicization during the Second Intifada, during protests around the Second Intifada within their own countries, and realized very quickly, oh, the reason why our regimes aren't listening to us and aren't thinking about Palestine or supporting Palestine in the way that they want is because they're authoritarian. Therefore, we must change these authoritarian structures. So Palestine is a very key, I think, element in understanding you know, mobilization and social movements and anti-authoritarian resistance in the region as a whole. Now, for that reason, of course, authoritarian regimes, especially in the last couple of years, have repressed pro-Palestine sentiment and activism, especially as some countries have normalized relations with Israel and signed particular deals, because they know that it is this gateway to dissent for their own citizens. For other, you know, another set of reasons, pro-Palestine activism and dissent in the global north, so in the US, in the UK, Europe, is also criminalized for a different set of reasons, but similar outcomes. I would say from my perspective and from some of my ongoing research on the Palestinian diaspora and Palestinian organizing within the United States, there's been a lot of focus on protest and a lot of focus on street politics, less focus on building power. This has, I mean, and again, it's not necessarily, you know, out of stupidity or out of incompetence or anything like that, but given that the American system has been so repressive and has been so has had such little space to change, people are becoming quite cynical about engaging in any kind of formal politics. So some of that is understandable, the kind of focus on protest instead of other things. But then there's also this element that we have to recognize, which is that amongst the Palestinian diaspora in the United States and amongst people who support kind of the pro-Palestine movement in the United States, there's also this very limited anti-imperialist framework that doesn't recognize that there is a world beyond the United States. So that is a problem in kind of political analysis, and that has limited the utility of the pro-Palestine movement in the US in terms of how it might connect with other issues and how it might connect with or how it might even identify kind of trends in authoritarian politics across the globe. There is an attempt, as I said in my slides, there's been a lot of discussion about reviving the PLO, because people do want to move beyond this kind of stagnant status quo that we have currently, where all the focus is on the Palestinian Authority, and to incorporate the Palestinian diaspora and all the different Palestinian realities in a possible solution moving forward. So there are Palestinians in the Middle East, different parts of the Middle East, as well as in Europe, in the UK, the United States, I'm sorry, that have been discussing this idea of a Palestinian National Conference in order to possibly bring forward all the kind of thinkers, intellectuals, people with community ties to different Palestinian diaspora communities, and possibly begin the discussion of and the process of reviving the PLO. But it's not also fully connecting to the diaspora. So I was recently in Chile. I haven't, I don't think that the Palestinian Chilean diaspora, for example, is included in these discussions, as far as I'm aware, at least at least in the meetings that have been published. So I mean, that's the thing. But generally speaking, I think for solidarity and for activism to work within particular contexts, whether it's in the United States, whether it's the UK, Chile, Palestine cannot be an issue of just moral significance. Activists need to tie why Palestine is important to the realities of that local population's politics. It's very clear in the United States, I think, how Palestine is impacting domestic politics. So even if you don't care about Palestine, you have no moral, issues whatsoever, you're a complete sociopath, you still might be moved to think about the Palestinian question because it's impacting your own freedoms. It's impacting academic freedom. It's impacting your freedom of expression. It's taking your taxpayer funding, all of those kinds of connections that we can have. For those with a wider political lens, a political analysis, who are anti-authoritarian, Palestine is a very key factor in explaining the rise of and the consolidation of authoritarian actors in recent years. So in the Chilean context, I'm not enough of an expert to know what that would entail, but I know that organizations like the Comunidad are attempting to make those connections, and the Coordinadora and those kinds of organizations. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but I'll give space to the actual Chilean experts to discuss that.
Okay, with that cue, I think that means me. Yeah, so I want, oh yes, I'll start with Chile then. I think that in general, in the Chilean context, besides the cynicism with engaging in political protest and politics in general that Dana mentioned, that is general, I think that the social uprisings of 2019 left political activism with a very bad image. So I sense there's certain fear that any political movement will eventually develop into disorders in the street. We had 2 attempts or essays of constitution. So I think that hurt political activism and political discussion in general, as people just want to be quiet, or that I think harms in general political discussion. In the same context, I perceive certain concern with reputation, mainly in academic environment, that giving too much space to this political debate that is a sensitive topic in many ways can lead to a bad reputation or bad activities, or so there's a concern about that. And also when BDS is mentioned with and the involvement of Israeli universities in colonization, military practices, there's the direct response that no, universities are by definition a place of debates of debate of ideas and pluralistic environment that needs to be respected and protected. There's an excellent research on that made by Maya Wind in the book called Towers of Ivory and Steel: How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom. That does an amazing work of research of how Israeli universities are involved in the Israeli military apparatus. So that's a short context on Chile. Regarding other spaces of solidarity, an initiative that is very near and dear to me is Combatants for Peace. There is a movement that is in Israel and in the Palestinian occupied territories that actually nowadays is protesting and defying the Israeli army together with Palestinian landowners in the Bethlehem area, just northwest in a small town called Bejala, which is where most of Palestinian Chileans come from, because of the settlement enterprise and the intent to build a colony in an area called Batir Mahrur, for a new colony in the land of Palestinian families. And this is, I think, it's a great example of co-resistance between different people, that I think it's very emotional. It's not in a context where polarization is more common, especially in the social media era. Such movements are quite refreshing, especially when they are on the ground. And I've seen both Israelis and Palestinians facing together this injustice. So this is something to look at. I think that we have. I think that unless the former colonial powers don't shift their political praxis, we have a narrow scope of movement. Just yesterday, the UK government announced that it will suspend some arms, weapons shipment, but they are 30 types of weapons out of 380. So, well, that's an advancement, but it's not nearly enough. And in that context, and also to connect with some of the points that Joanna mentioned about perpetual victimhood, which I found a very interesting concept. I think that to Palestinians, there's a demand of being the perfect victim. And this is a concept that I take from the Palestinian and American lawyer Noura Erakat, who has an excellent book called Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. And she mentions this kind of unusual request for Palestinians, to Palestinians, about being the victim, perfect victim. So when they are denied normal negotiations, they are requested to go into negotiations with the occupying power in a very uneven position. When direct negotiations are known to be not working, at least for 40 years. Then when the Palestinians try multilateral diplomacy and ask for the recognition of the Palestinian state, they get a no from the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, most of the European countries. Just Spain recently announced it will recognize it. But in general, you see the third world recognizing, but not the first. Then when Palestinians try economic boycott, no, that is responded with no, that's anti-Semitism. When that is directed to the Israeli and international companies that benefit from the colonial occupation. So it's politically motivated. Same with academic boycott. Then when Palestinians try to go to the ICC, the response, both from Israel and the US, is to threaten the Palestinian leadership with cutting their funds. Also because how the PA is gets its revenues is that the tax from the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory are collected by Israel, and then they are given to the Palestinian government. So there's no autonomy. And they also, the US was known, Israel as well, to threaten the then prosecutor of the ICC. Then when Palestinians go ask for peacekeeping operations to protect the Palestinian civil population in the Palestinian occupied territories, such as the ones that are present in southern Lebanon or in Syria, they get a no for an answer in the Security Council, at least a veto. Then when they organize, and this is the last thing, when they organize protest walking from Gaza to the fence that divides Gaza with Israel, they get shot, which is not an internationally recognized border. And the Palestinians living in Gaza that marched have the right to return to their homes wherever they are. They get shot, and as a result, we had more than 300 Palestinians assassinated by the occupation forces and over 4,000 Palestinians hurt during 2018. So they are left with no political space to operate, right? As the Palestinian issue has been framed since the beginning as a humanitarian problem and not as a political problem. That's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna, maybe you want to share some ideas, and then we have 2 questions from YouTube. I already have here.
I'm actually not sure I have much to add. I mean, so much has been covered by Dana and Marcelo. Maybe just from a psychological perspective to give some hope that, I mean, yes, we are seeing a lot of repression and the criminalization of nonviolent resistance that is, celebrated in other contexts, right? Like in history classes, we celebrate Mandela, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, who used boycott as a tactic, right, while at the same time repressing and criminalizing those tactics here. So that's depressing. And we see this disconnect that Dana described, I think, here in the US as well, right, where people, I mean, 70% of Democrats are against sending arms to Israel, actually, and 80% support a ceasefire, but that's not reflected in what the political leaders are doing. So there's also growing, discontent and disconnect, and it reflects in American electoral politics as well. I mean, uncommitted movement, or how Kamala Harris's Israel politics are seen by voters, right? It is a big, real issue and threat to power. What is maybe hopeful to keep in mind with regard to the repression is that the literature on repression and resistance also shows this backlash effect. Repression isn't often successful, or it might be successful at squashing temporarily some forms of resistance, but people move to other forms of resistance as well. And also in many cases, there's also effects on increasing protest, which we've seen in the US and elsewhere too, right? Like there's repression of Palestine solidarity protests, but they keep growing and coming up in other forms and shapes, like the encampments. So when repression happens in one place or form, then people find other ways to resist. And there's also moral outrage about the repression that further grows the movement, right? And actually gives it more supporters because people see the disconnect between, the general population's attitudes and then the repression from above. So that's maybe a little bit hopeful in all this otherwise depressing state of affairs.
Yes, and also the creativity of resistance strategies, right? So we have 2 questions made on the live chat on YouTube. I'm actually going to make the 2 of them because they're somewhat connected. They're connected both with academia and things that are going on within academia at different levels, but I think they can be answered and whoever's wants to speak to them. So the first one is to ask about your opinion about the current measures that were taken at the New York University. I don't know if you're aware, but last week there was a resolution of including words such as Zionist in their anti-discrimination politics, considering Zionist as a protected category as being included within the same range as other categories such as race and gender. And how do you feel about this, about this category being included within those definitions of anti-discrimination policies? And then another question regarding the current situation in Chile, but that I also think speaks about other international situations where there's been a lot of attention or importance being put forth about cutting relationships and academic relations between universities in different parts of the world with Israeli universities at the moment. So do you think that is important? And what kind of impact do you think this might have? And this, of course, relates with research and the book, The Towers of Ivory, that Marcelo mentioned. So maybe if one of you wants to focus on one of them or maybe two of them. And also I would also perhaps include, a connected one about this conflation that has been going on and this backlash in terms of the pro-Palestine solidarity movements and protests about this conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism and certain definitions, for example, by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and how problematic this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism can be exactly for allowing for the repression of pro-Palestine movements across the world. So yeah, we still have 15, 13 minutes to go on. So please feel free to do some final reflections on these questions as you wish, and the word is yours. So anyone wants to start? Maybe now we can move a bit the other way around. You want to maybe go ahead, Joanna?
Yeah, I can just try to very quickly talk about the conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism because, that is what I deal with a lot for personal and political reasons, including that my family, before the Holocaust, during and after, were never Zionists. And there is a rich history of Jewish political thought. There are many important Jewish political movements, such as the Bundeslabor movement that was extremely popular in pre-war Poland before the Holocaust, that was anti-Zionist. And, by conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, it is actually denying that history and the reality of Jewish pluralism, both in the present and in the past. And to me, that is anti-Semitic, right? When you are denying a people's history and kind of conflating the two. And it is also actually puzzling to me. I mean, in some ways it's not puzzling, but people are trying to have it both ways when on the one hand, Zionists, whether it's Jewish Zionists or Christian Zionists or other Zionists, are arguing that, in order to protect Jews, you need to protect Zionism and Israel. But then at the same time, crying about anti-Semitism when people then, conflate Israel and Jews and, blame Jews for what's happening in Israel, while at the same time doing, which is of course problematic, but when we see all Jewish institutions, mainstream institutions throwing themselves behind support for Israel and arguing that this is what we need in order to keep Jews safe, we should not be surprised when people then actually go and blame Jews for what, is happening in Israel, which is problematic. So it's, it's troubling for several ways. There's a good alternative to the IHRA definition, which is the Jerusalem what is it called? Jerusalem Declaration, I think, or definition of anti-Semitism. And that one explicitly, clarifies the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and says that from the river to the sea is not anti-Semitic, and all of these things, right? So, and that definition has been developed and signed by many scholars of Holocaust and genocide studies, Middle Eastern studies, Jewish scholars, etc. So it's a solid scholarly definition that can be used instead. But in general, the attempts to conflate, again, it serves political interests, obviously. Anti-Semitism and the history of Jewish suffering is being instrumentalized in order to support Israel and its role in the global world order. And at the same time, it is actually denying our history and pluralism within Jewish communities.
Thank you. Marcelo?
No, I think it was quite clear. From the Chilean perspective, I consider that there's not the needed knowledge to make the necessary distinctions in this topic. So people tend to do this cognitive shortcut, right? So when one speaks about academic boycott and why it's needed, then the cognitive shortcut is to say universities are pluralistic, are place where different opinions are encountered. But I really consider that Maya Wynn's research is clarifying in that, and how the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Bar-Ilan University, Technion, are universities that do have agreements with Chilean universities for exchange, students, academics. And at the same time, they are the hubs where military technology is developed to continue the oppression and the systematic annihilation of the Palestinian population. There's a direct collaboration between the Israeli army and these institutions. And I think that we are at a certain point in which either you reject that and you reject having at least not collaborating with that, or you are part of that. So yeah.
Thank you. Dana?
Yes. I guess I don't have necessarily much to add, but in the United States, in the context of the US, I think it's pretty obvious that because there is, as Joanna mentioned, like particularly a generational divide, even within the Jewish community, the response from those in power, whether in the US government or in institutions of Jewish life, has been to try to at least shut down the discourse. And so to me, and to a lot of people, it seems that, you can't win the argument, so you make it so that you can't have the argument. That being said, and this is me personally, I know lots of people disagree with me. I think it's, as a Palestinian, I think it's a waste of my time to enter into discussions about what Zionism means or doesn't mean with Jewish people or non-Jewish people, whoever is having this discussion. Especially in the context of what's happening in Gaza, because when you for me, it seems to me like strategically, when you enter into that discussion, then it's opening up this whole can of worms about what words mean and how they make you feel, and who, honestly, in some ways, very reasonable arguments about Jewish trauma, and then in other ways, very bad faith arguments about what these things mean. The state, whatever it could have been, is now what it is. And it is the impact of that state project is being very clearly seen in Gaza. So I don't even want to entertain the discussion anymore. If Zionism makes you feel lovely, then I have no problem with that. But the impacts of that need to end. It's not I guess this is an issue of positionality too. So like, I think Jewish people are having these discussions, and that's totally fine. I'm not suggesting these shouldn't be had, but as a Palestinian, I don't even think the term is useful to debate. And I know a lot of Palestinians disagree with me. I know that for a lot of other Palestinians, like, to bring Zionism as like the main ideological framework and say that you have to be explicitly anti-Zionist, like, this is something that people, activists and things like that are making that decision. I am a lone academic, and this is just my personal opinion. Yeah, I think that I'll just leave it there.
And maybe you'd like to give some last words about what's happening within academia and this repression of academic freedom in terms of pro-Palestine positions, because we know they are going on, right? Professors being suspended, professors being investigated for, online posting or even talking about the issue.
Yeah, it's what's happened, as you said, is there is this backlash also within academia. So it is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, like, academic freedom is on the line here. It's been, and I think academics, even those who don't speak about Palestine or research Palestine or have no interest in it, are not recognizing fully the scope of the threat to themselves, because what's happening is the anti-Palestinian sentiment and attempt to control the discourse is pairing up with right-wing kind of anti-intellectualism. And this, America's a big place, so this is different in different places. If you're in Florida, like, you're completely screwed. In other places, or if you're in a private versus public institution, there are variations of how repressed you feel right now. But generally speaking, like, this is about the ability to do research, the ability to do objective research, and the ability to engage in that. So it's not just that they're going after professors for, like, maybe saying or spouting off on Twitter. They're going after people with expertise, and that is, I think, a higher level of threat even. And so, yeah, I think it should be concerning to everyone.
Thank you so much. As far as I understand, we have no other questions, and we're just on time to finish the seminar. I want to thank once again Dana, Marcelo, and Joanna for your thoughts, for your very thought-provoking comments, and to discuss your research with all of us. I think we need to have more spaces to discuss these issues. Of course, there are many more issues we haven't touched upon. And of course, the current situation in Gaza is ongoing. And what's most important is to stop the occupation, to have a permanent ceasefire at the moment. But I also think, and I hope you agree with me, that these discussions are important as well. The activism on the streets and wherever possible should continue to happen and raise our voices. So thank you very, very much for your time, for being available, and also to everyone listening to us. Remember, this is one first event of many others. We will be developing it. We will be continuing to support at the Universidad de O'Higgins. And yes, thank you everyone for being here. And yeah, have a nice day, hopefully a restful one. And let's keep in touch. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you for organizing this, Anna.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invite.
Nice to meet you again. Bye.
Bye.